7. And again, it only applies to government systems or government contractor systems. Kind of a one-off here is the Veterans Affairs Information Security Act. This came about specifically because of one breach, a breach that compromised the records of 26.5 million veterans in the same year. It does apply to veterans' records. It's not clear whether we would have had sufficient legislation with FISMA already. You know, was this really needed? So it is a sort of a one-off. And then we have two big private sector laws. And I know that you know them, but maybe I'll tell you something a little new about them. We'll see. HIPAA. HIPAA is the Health Insurance, not Health Information, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Two main titles. The first one is to regulate the availability and breadth of group health plans, to limit restrictions that a group health plan can place on benefits for pre-existing conditions. This is largely to allow people to change jobs or to not have to remain in the same job because of fear of losing their health insurance. So, Title II has some provisions for fraud and abuse within the healthcare system. And it is in Title II that you see the administrative simplifications, and that includes the privacy rule and the security rule. But my point is that we really have the privacy rule and the security rule because we needed to have a job mobility law. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, Financial Services Modernization Act, 1999. This act repealed part of a former act, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. The Glass-Steagall Act prohibited a bank from offering investment, commercial banking, insurance services. So it kept some of our financial services separate. And what Gramm-Leach-Bliley did was legalize mergers on a permanent basis. So it was really a Financial Services Modernization Act. Covered a lot of entities, non-bank mortgage lenders, loan brokers, debt collectors, tax return preparers. And what was going on is people were saying, wait, you're now going to have, one entity is now going to have all sorts of pieces of personal information about me. And so you saw the financial privacy rule and a safeguards rule. The privacy rule is exactly that, a privacy rule. Safeguard rule is similar to the FISMA, which calls for these financial services organizations to have information security programs that do monitoring, detection, prevention, response, and data breach disclosure. And there's specifically in this one a pretexting protection. Very similar story to HIPAA. You saw privacy and information security safeguards being put in because we needed financial services modernization. And that brings us to the 44 state laws. Here are the states without laws, in case you were curious. And there's the trend in when they were enacted. So you see almost half of them in 2006. California, as most of you probably know, was the first in 2003. Alaska's was the last to take effect in January of this year. So these state laws, they pertain to a lot of entities. They pertain to businesses. They pertain to community hospitals that might not necessarily be covered by HIPAA. They pertain to local election boards, schools, universities. And it sort of follows the trend that we have seen in other areas, such as education, where education in our country, public policy for education is largely delegated to states. Federal money comes, it comes often in block grants to states, and states make decisions. States set a lot of education policy. And so these 44 data breach disclosure laws have followed that same trend, you know, that in some regards we're a federation of states, and states need to have the ability to govern themselves. That's some of the thinking behind having 44 state laws. There's benefits to that, there are costs to that. So these state laws, they're not the same. There are differences among them. So this further adds to the patchwork, right? We've got the FTC Act, we've got the privacy rule, we've got FISMA, we've got the Veterans Affairs, we've got Gramm-Leach-Bliley, we've got HIPAA, and now we have 44 state laws that have differences. They do have commonalities. All of the 44 state laws include a provision for personal information. All of them spell out notification requirements. All of them spell out notification procedures and a timeline. But like everything, the devil is in the details, and that's where the differences are. There's not a consistent definition across all of them about what personal information is. There's not a consistent definition about a breach, what a breach is. There's not a consistent definition. In some cases, some of them provide safe harbor. You don't have to disclose that there was a breach if the data were encrypted, but they don't call out encryption standards. That's left to the, you know, yeah, right to the judgment of the breached company, agency, entity. Potential risk is not defined. We've already discussed risk is difficult in this field. So what we see is that any interstate entity, and that includes like Purdue University, can be forced to comply with multiple state laws. And this can be cumbersome, it can be costly. Sometimes the entity chooses to just comply with the most stringent. Because if we comply with the most stringent, then we're compliant with all of the others. That too could be costly. Maybe you're having to do more. How do you evaluate that? So a few of the differences, all 44 covers 6 things in personal information. Social security number, driver's license number, state ID number, and these 3 types of financial account numbers, as long as it's also in combination with an access code, a security code, a password. But then they start to vary. They vary. Some of them cover PIN numbers, some of them cover date of birth, medical information, biometric data, genomic data. Okay, so there are some commonalities, but then differences. Notification requirements. About half of the data breach 44 laws, about half of them are acquisition-based. If the data were acquired, the entity is required to report it. About half of them are risk-based, meaning if the data were acquired and they determined that there's a reasonable risk, reasonable likelihood of harm or injury, then they have to report it. We've already talked about the difficulty with reasonable likelihood of risk, harm. It's a judgment call for them. I already talked a little bit about the encryption standards. Covered entities, all of the laws pertain to entities that own or license data. About half of them, half of the state laws, pertain to entities that maintain computerized data. Can you hear me buzzing? I'm sorry if you can. It's children calling me. And then in some cases, they pertain to government agencies that are not covered by federal laws. So it could be local government,